Hello, hello. Welcome to the Takedown special edition. I have Professor Tommy Curry with us today to have a conversation. Professor, if you would go ahead and introduce yourself to our audience.
Yes. So my name is Dr. Tommy J. Curry. I'm the author of The Man Not, Race, Class, Genre, and the Dilemmas of Black Manhood. I'm one of the pioneering scholars in a new discipline really called Black Male Studies, which focuses on the analysis of racialized men and boys, specifically the concept of phallicism or racially subjugated maleness. This is a comparative discipline that utilizes not only empirical work from sociology, psychology, economics, etc., but also tries to redefine or better articulate the distortions that racism brings to maleness and gender more generally. Much of my works focus on critical race theory, the intellectual history of Black thought in the 19th century, and of course, arguments about Black militancy and the Black radical tradition.
Now that's a mouthful right there. See, when you lay it out like that, it's hard to say where I want to start. But ideally, where I would like to start is kind of when you said you have to redefine things, or you're kind of like one of the leading scholars on something. What kind of led you to be where you are in terms of your work? What kind of influenced you to go down this path?
Well, I started off coming out of grad school, specifically writing about critical race theory and the permanence of racism. And as you move through, the academy, you find that there's lots of discussions, especially in liberal arts, that are not motivated by facts, but more so feelings or perspectives, or what we generally talk about in terms of under the rubric of experience. And I became quickly dissatisfied with that. I was more interested in showing how wealth gaps between Black families and white families endure throughout time, how disproportionate incarceration rates between Blacks and whites showed that there was, disparate impact and disparate treatment. That, even when we look at studies in implicit bias, what does this mean in terms of police brutality or time to pull the trigger? These types of things interest me. I'm fascinated by evidence and how that evidence motivates us to form larger theories. And what I found is that following the evidence, anytime I tried to speak about the particular and peculiar aspects and oppression of Black males, that there was lots of resistance to that. So even in something like police brutality or mass incarceration, where the numbers are so skewed, the numbers are so disproportionate in terms of articulating and really showing an obviousness of Black male vulnerability and Black male disadvantage, I would go to conferences and have the resistance of even talking about Black men being victims. So over time, over years, I kept getting the same response. And this wasn't anything that was critical of any particular theory at this point. At this point, I was not making arguments against intersectionality or Black feminism generally. I was just trying to articulate descriptive conversations about Black men, that Black men were victims of intimate partner violence, that I'm just bringing wealth of evidence, and people were just not receptive to that idea. They didn't want to hear anything else about Black men. So over time, I found that these were largely based in a set of ideological dispositions or paradigms, rather, that did not see Black males as vulnerable. And this largely comes about, I think, in the work that we get from intersectionality theorists, which assert that Black men are privileged, disadvantaged categories, that they still benefit from patriarchy. And I had to say, I remember being at a conference, I said, wait a minute, if Black men benefit from patriarchy, then they have to be the dumbest patriarchs in all of history. Because you're saying that they endorse a system where, so for white men, patriarchy leads to the accumulation of wealth, the ownership of property, the paternalism over families. That means that Black men endorse a system of patriarchy and try to imitate a system of patriarchy that leads households run by women, where Black men are the most unemployed, where Black men are the least educated, where Black men have the lowest life expectancy. I was like, if they endorse this system, how is it efficient for them to do so? How do they accumulate wealth? How do they accumulate property? And because of that large contradiction, I said that it was impossible and that we need to think of different frames. which is not something that's vastly different, because you see in the work of people like R.W.S. Connell, who came up with the theory of hegemonic masculinity. You see in the work of Anthony LaMelle Jr., who talks about Black masculinity and the racist capitalist politics of our political economy of Black masculinity, that these things have already been articulated. So I asked myself, why is there such a resistance to incorporating these findings into liberal arts and gender theory? And then I found that I think that's because there's just an impasse. There's a way in which Black men are understood more so based on stereotype rather than sociology.
Let's dig off into that. See, you laid out a lot of groundwork there, but let's try to back up a little bit. And you said, even in academia, that you find there's a resistance to even approaching the subject. So what kind of resistance do you run into? Like, what are they saying when you've laid out evidence in front of them?
Lots of things. There's lots of things. Most recently, I submitted an invited summary of my book, The Man Not, to a feminist blog. I was happy to contribute to it because I thought, that Black men certainly have something to say about sexual violence and what I call a kind of genre oppression. But evidently some of the constituents thought that it was offensive to have a conversation about Black men as being victims of rape, victims of domestic violence, and to articulate Black males as something other than patriarchs. That's one example. In the book, I talk about how two editors invited a piece on anti-Blackness and slavery. And then when I wrote it on the rape of Black men, they rejected the piece because they didn't like that it was on Black males. They said that if you submitted this to a journal, I'm sure we get accepted, no problem. But for our book, we don't want to focus our privileged Black men as victims of oppression. So you find lots of censorship, that people don't want to have conversations about Black men outside of feminist lens. And while feminism certainly has its own articulation of Black masculinity, which I adamantly disagree with, and I think that you can look at some of the anecdotes. I had a debate a few years ago with Dr. Eichert about some of these tropes, some of the arguments that, Stokely Carmichael, for instance, said that the position of Black women were prone. As you know, from the beginning of my book, I actually traced that quote down. I found where it comes from. And it was said at an SNCC meeting to two white women who wrote a position paper on the place of women in the movement. They said Stokely broke that as a joke in the meeting, that people laughed, and that they were able to discuss the roles and new roles for women within SNCC. That part of the story is never told. It's never told that the two women that he allegedly made this comment to both saw Stokely as the champion of their cause, that he supported their position paper, that he was fundamentally transformative in the ideas of what women should do within political movements, which is something they admit themselves they didn't have an idea of, because this wasn't something that had ever been done before this point of history, to figure out the program of working class revolutionary movements and the role women had of that. You see the same thing happen when you talk about Kathleen Cleaver, where she said, look, Black men came home from war, they were veterans. So it makes sense that Black men led militant and armed self-defense efforts, because they had to teach women how to use guns, because war was something undertaken by men primarily within that time period. So we have lots of tropes and anecdotes that talk about the alleged biases of Black men and the presumed patriarchal power that they've imposed. But then when you look into the history just a little bit, you see that there's a much more complicated and complex story involved with how Black men actually understood their roles in communities as being racially subjugated. So that's kind of the, I've been booed at conferences. I've had Black feminists boo me because when I presented chapter 4 of the book and talked about Black men being victims of rape, raised Black women. So there are some portions of the academy which believes that any conversation about Black men necessarily take away focus or understanding the plight of Black women. I don't believe that's true. I think that's a silly argument because nobody says that, white people are basically 1.2 million in the academy. And 1.2 white people not talking about black people, don't erase black people. And I have a hard time believing that the 41,000 or 47,000 black men, you know, and if 500 of them talk about black men, that it erases the 71,000 black women. It just is nonsense, right? Black women overwhelmingly outnumber black men. They have overwhelmingly solidified their position, at least in terms of literature, not in terms of representation, compared to black males. So I think that black males have the necessity and the freedom to discuss their own experiences and their own plight without these zero-sum identity politics games, right? And I think that that's been the major obstacle in terms of getting workout, is that any discussion of black men beyond contemporary theories are just offensive to certain people.
Yeah, and the strangest thing, the strangest thing is like you made a comment earlier before we started this conversation that you said, you know, no group is the most oppressed in all categories, you know.
Exactly.
And I think that it stands to reason that like there are certain categories where we have to understand, like in this context, this group is suffering from a particular issue a little bit more than another group, or this issue is more impactful on this group than another group. And I think that's just, you know, being objective and being honest, looking at the situation. Do you find that when you're talking about black men, even black people in general, when you're talking about to white people, but when you're talking about black males specifically, do you find that that's also an issue?
Yeah, because I think most of our understandings of black people are based in identity politics and not any real empiricism. You know, when I was talking to Jared Ball, you know, he asked me for an example of where he thinks, you know, gender theories, that domestic violence is a very important example, because we frame domestic violence based on second wave feminist theories that men, you know, abuse women for power. And this doesn't hold true in lower class white communities. And it certainly has never held true in black communities, because you see almost equal parity in terms of the rates of violence and in terms of the rates of intimate partner homicide. So when you look at that kind of problem and you look at what clinicians and epidemiologists are saying about it, then you have to ask yourself some real questions. Well, why is this the case? Like, I start from that perspective. How is it possible that we have a theory that says men disproportionately abuse women for power, but then when you look at the disproportionality of domestic abuse rates, you see it both in women and both in men? And what the clinicians argue, and these are even black feminist psychologists, that when you look at black and brown peoples, the gender disparity disappears. It's more of a class-based issue. So if I have people who are social scientists who are writing case studies based on treating victims of domestic violence, and then I have to deal with people in English who've only read bell hooks, I'm going to choose the clinicians, the psychologists, and the epidemiologists, right? That seems pretty simple to me. But what happens is liberal arts theorists, liberal arts scholars have ideological blinders on. Their reality is contoured by the theories that they endorse. And I fundamentally disagree with that as a efficient way to study the black community. We have to know something about the black community. And what we have today is, because everything is so heavily based in identity, we know very little facts, very few facts about how black people actually exist in this country. For example, when we talk about statutory rape, you know, we're talking about a very complicated issue, because black people traditionally have sex earlier than white people in this country. For black boys, that age is before the age of 14. That means that a lot of the sex that black men are having that socializes them is going to be statutory rape of some sort, or certainly an early sexual experience, even if it's not coercive. That fundamentally changes the conversations we have about how black men view sex. We don't have those conversations. We just assume black men are predators and they prey on black women. But that's not what the evidence actually shows. In the previous literature and the studies that we've conducted, we see that young black boys are being socialized earlier and manifest a lot of the same traumas that you see for victims of rape. You know, higher promiscuity, child before the age of 21, contracted, you know, having at least one sexually transmitted disease, depression, etc. So all these things combine to give us a small picture of what young Black men go through in this society. And it's not, let's imitate white men. It's very specific traumas related to their oppression, their economic deprivation, and the reality that they're being marginalized based on their maleness because they're considered dangerous. And these conversations very rarely move beyond, oh, well, we think Black men are dangerous. But what effect does that have on a young Black boy's psyche? How does a Black boy internalize the notion that he's a danger, and how does he try to change his behavior to make other people feel safe? Right?
Let me back it up, because you said something that was very, very interesting, and I want to get into that, because there's a critique that says that, you know, when we're talking about sexual violence, you know, against Black women, you know, I think the biggest line of critique is that you can't say that this is not an issue for Black women, or that this issue shouldn't be talked about or something because the violence is bidirectional, or that it may not be patriarchy. I think that's a huge issue. And I've seen people come back and say that when people make the same argument that you just made.
Well, I don't know what that means. So, and here's the problem. This is what I'm saying. To say that Black women are being raped, or statutorily raped, or abused is a fact, because we can see that. We have evidence of that. What I'm arguing about is the cause. So I'm not disagreeing with the fact that there's disproportionate sexual and intimate partner violence and homicide to Black women. We know what that looks like. We know that that's just the reality of our communities. But in those very same data sets where we get all the information, we also see that Black men are disproportionately affected by the very same ills. My question is, why do you keep attributing to this mystical cause of patriarchy that we can't prove, and then ignore, you know, the perpetration of violence by women against Black males? I mean, we see the same thing with child abuse. You know, this is why I'm a big fan of Stacey Patton's work, because she actually tried to have the conversation about Black women abusing children, and the rates of abuse are double that for whites. Now, what explains that? Like, if we always have to end the conversation at my experience or how I feel, then when do we get to actually talk about the kinds of things that are outside of you, or things that you don't want to acknowledge? Black women certainly have the right to talk about all sorts of violence that affects them. And Black men have a right to question it insofar as they're made out to be perpetrators. Black men have the right to talk about all the violence that affects them. And Black women have the right to inquire in terms of perpetration. That's how scholarship moves. I don't know what to say when someone says, well, those aren't conversations that we should not have, because that sounds like censorship.
Well, I think I may have misstated the argument. Personally, it's not my argument. I was just trying to paraphrase what was expressed to me, because I think what they were saying is that, like, it doesn't negate or doesn't minimize the conversation that they were having to bring that up. And I feel like I kind of agree with that. But at the same time, I think that what we were talking about now was the issue, like you said, of perpetration. You know, perpetration, right. and even really more like why are you doing it, or why is this happening? And I think that argument or that area should be open to discussion, and we should be able to challenge that, whether it's, you know, patriarchy or some other cause. And I think when you said, you know, I framed it as sexual violence when I asked the question, but really this could apply to physical violence, you know, domestic violence in general.
Absolutely.
You know, this could apply to that as well.
Absolutely.
Would you say it applies to it pretty much, like, you know, lock and key?
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, we find most of this is previous literature. This isn't just me, but I mean, the previous literature is pretty clear that in terms of domestic violence, inter-partner homicide, and even early sexual experience, you find parity, right? So you find bidirectionality in terms of perpetration. The difference we see is largely that women don't get convicted for the statutory rape of Black boys. That's one of the major problems that we found in the literature. The other part, though, is that saying that violence is bidirectional doesn't take anything away from Black female victimization. It just means that they're victims in some cases, and in other cases, they're perpetrators. The same way that Black men are victims in some circumstances, which we don't usually see, and overwhelmingly overdetermine them based on perpetration. This is just the reality of an actual world. And I think that what happens is people, because they don't look at data sets, because they, again, you know, these are people who are, you know, consider themselves to be gender theorists or pop culture theorists. They don't concern themselves with the actual facts. They speak off of this kind of ideological frame and ideological disposition. And the effect of that is that it demonizes and condemns Black men, because it makes it makes black male perpetration of violence an ontological reality, part of the very definition of being black and male, rather than a sociological reality where black men are affected by their ecology, by the environment surrounding them. So if you have black men who have been victims of sexual abuse, or victims of child abuse, or victims of spousal abuse, or intimate partner abuse, then you see them in the next relationship and they beat their girlfriend. That's not because of their masculinity. That's because of the history, the 3 or 4 different antecedents of trauma that nobody's talked about or addressed. You know, the perpetrator needs mental health, health services and trauma counseling. They don't need some abstract and detached theory that says just because they're black males, this is why this is happening. I mean, I'll give you a counterexample. Despite the rates of child abuse in the black community that's overwhelmingly perpetrated by black women, you don't see any theories about black women being fundamentally deviant and more violent, because we automatically say that that's, racist social science. But then we take the same racist idea about black men, because the argument that black men abuse women has been an argument since the 1860s. So we take a racist argument and we fast forward and call it a gender theory, and they say people like, oh, well, it's not because black men are black, it's because they're men, and because they're hypersexual and hyper masculine and hyper violent, all these hyper, personality traits. So it's the same kind of racist logic. It's just that nobody wants to talk about it because we discuss it as a gender construct rather than a racial construct. And I think that has the effect of blinding us to the ways in which white social science, especially like in terms like hypermasculinity, has been carried over and adopted by some of these gender theories.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that. I also want to pick up on what you said earlier, where you talked about you said, basically people not really necessarily looking at the data, but really more or less kind of picking up, popular things that have been put in front of them. And I believe this is like by design. I believe this stuff is put out there by design. Popular ideas can be popularized for a purpose, for people who have power and use it to popularize certain ideas with an agenda. And can you speak to, have you kind of ran into that, or do you see that?
No, I mean, well, look, in the book, I'm very clear that I find it ironic that the very same racial stereotypes that black men suffer under and deal with in society often become the same kind of gender theories that we talk about and use to describe black masculinity. So we talk about black men as being in society as being aggressive, scary, and violent. And in gender theories, we talk about them as being hyper masculine, patriarchal, and violent, right, towards women and children. We talk about their toxic masculinity. So I think that there is a reflection of the kind of racism in society that's kind of inculcated into theory that has not been seriously questioned. Right?
And see, you're talking about like people that are actually expressing real theory, right? Well, I'm talking about, your lay person that may just kind of wander into the discussion,
well, yeah, that's because they've internalized negative stereotypes about black men. Yeah.
That stuff leaks down to like pop culture, and then next you have people that are not necessarily trained in that arena, but they carry these things around, and it becomes like almost like a common sense just by virtue of being.
Yeah, it becomes intuitive, right? But that's what I meant when I said it's socialized, right? That, I mean, think about it. You can literally have people that read blogs, feminist blogs or gender blogs or pop culture blogs, whatever they may be, all come out with the exact same view of black men. So that tells us something about the socialization process that's going on by these various authors. I have to date, I have yet to see a blog that actually says, here's Bell Hook's theory, here's Connell's theory, here's why it's wrong, right? Black men are always described through feminist lenses, and I don't understand why. I don't understand why one picture of black men has to be the only picture we have. If black feminism or gender theory or intersectionality wants to have a certain view of black men, and you have social dominance theory or genocide studies or black male studies that has a completely different view, then the argument should be which one is correct and how do we test it? And right now what you have is this kind of pop culture acceptance of intersectionality and certain notions of black masculinity that are toxic. And that becomes the basis of how we understand and think about all black men. When in reality, the actual perpetrators of violence against women, or even violence more generally, is a very, very small portion of the adult black male population, right? Because you have to think that generally, when you're talking about black men, for example, who are perpetrators of intimate partner homicide, the number you're talking about is I mean, the last several years has been no bigger than 200, maybe 250 over the last, within the last decade or so. So that's a vastly different perspective. I don't know what I say about 250. I mean, if you jump it up to 500 or 5,000, I mean, you're talking about less than 1% of the adult black male population in the United States. So I don't know what that says about black men more generally. I don't understand why black men are defined by the smallest, the most minute minority of their group, as how that serves as the basis or foundation of theory, because there's no other group that we do that for. We don't look at the small population of black women that abuse children and say, well, black women hate children. But somehow with black men, we see a very small population of black men abuse and kill women. And we say that that's the natural development of masculinity,
or like that's the average case, more generally. Like that's described as perhaps like the average case or something, when really it's a fringe.
Exactly. Yeah, the more general case.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. So I think we've addressed those two things. Now, in light of what's been going on, I know you're also an Africana studies professor as well. You hold that. Can you perhaps try to lay some context for kind of like where we are today? Like, we just had those recent upswells of white supremacy kind of, showing up out of anywhere. Can you relate that to your work? And especially genocidal studies. I want to talk about that as well.
Yeah, well, here's a few things. I think you can see that the propaganda that's been, disseminated in places like University of Utah and Texas State, all have what black male studies scholars refer to as anti-black misandric images or claims. So what we mean by that is we mean that black men are being described not only as racial threats, but sexual threats to the white race. The most prevalent example of that is, the flyer that was passed around at the University of Utah said that blacks rape women, at a rate, I think it said like at 100 a day or some ridiculous number. Mm-hmm. Now, most people would say, well, that's just racism, but that's not what's going on there. The blacks they're referring to are clearly black men, because they're talking about blacks raping white women. And when you look at something like that, when you look at how the ideas of racism, of black male deviance and violence, then you have to pay attention to how black men become particularly vulnerable to what's not stated. And what's not stated there is racism is a function of how whites define and impose negative views and power dynamics on black people. But within that, the gender aspect or the sexualized aspect is that black males become the culprits of the kinds of violence they fear. So white people or the white race or these white supremacists are not arguing that black women are going to rape them out of existence. But that is a fear they have about black men. So the arguments that you have concerning the alt-right and the recruitment of women into the alt-right is very much based in the idea that these black men, that these Mexican men are all rapists. And it's only that white nationalism that could possibly save and protect the wombs of white women. Ooh. This kind of rhetoric, right? These kinds of notions overwhelmingly focus on or justify both the dehumanization of black males and other racialized males, as well as their extermination. Right? So the world that we're entering right now is a political resistance based in the fear or paranoia that the endogamy, or the ability of the white race to reproduce, is fundamentally threatened by the introduction of black, brown, Muslim, and other racialized males into this society. And that piece of the puzzle is what people don't want to talk about. And it's funny because, when Donald Trump was first running for president, and I've said this in other interviews, when Donald Trump said Mexicans are rapists, I said he's appealing to white women voters. And everybody was like, no, this is a racist statement. He's xenophobic. I was like, no, you're misunderstanding. I was like, the conservative platform is appealing to an ethnological fear, a fear that the white race will lose in demographic majority. And when they become the demographic minority, they will be outproduced, out-reproduced by alien races. So when Donald Trump says that to white women, he says, we will protect your wombs. And now you see the same rhetoric by alt-right women who are believing, just like you saw in Nazi Germany, that the greatest duty they could serve to the white race is to be the incubators of more white people. So the dynamics and language of how we understand racism has been so distorted by the civil rights movement. And when I say that, this is what I mean. Because we had civil rights and there were anti-discrimination laws, our views about racism shifted from a kind of colonial Jim Crowism that focused on sexual violence and threats that Black people pose to white reproduction to an argument about how Black people do not benefit the same way from law and work and economics as white people do. So in the post-civil rights era, all the arguments about race became about equality, how Black people should be equal to whites, how Black people should get the same things as whites, right? This became the argument. But before civil rights, all the arguments, you can see this in, Dick Gregory's autobiography. You can see this, you can see this, in E. Franklin Frazier's analysis of the South, was about the paranoia that white people had about Black sexuality. Because in the world where you separated Blacks from whites, the fear was if they intermingled, then Black men would impregnate white women and Black women would corrupt white culture. So that's been lost. We don't talk about that anymore. And with this infusion of ethno-nationalism, we can see that the endogamic fears that white people have had about Black people, especially Black men, have resurfaced as a political logic by which they conduct themselves, in which they try to assert that they're vulnerable as a race, that they're being outpopulated, so to speak.
Now, see, that's really like a hidden. That's really like a hidden critique that's lost, because of course I'm not old enough to go back and be around during that time and hear what people spoke about. But even I missed that part. I'm focused, like you said, I will be more focused on the last part. Like, how do we do in society? Black people don't get the same things. We're not able to attain the same things. We are subject to different roles in society. We're limited in some way because of our Blackness. But I never really thought about that other component to it, and to me, when stuff like this flares up, it just seems so foreign. And I know, go ahead.
Well, no, I was going to say, but this is one of the reasons that I study 19th century ethnology so heavily, is that you get everything that's happening right now with Donald Trump and the alt-right is really a resurgence of ethnological logic, and that's the idea that races are families, that the feminism, right? And this is what's really interesting. This is why I criticize feminism. Feminism was a response to Black belt suffrage, where the first wave feminists saw their greatest role as reproducing the white race, right? So this is what they were arguing about. They were arguing that Black men were raped, and they were arguing that if you want to take over the world, you need white women to do it. And you see the same kind of logic being applied today. The only difference is that because we have a liberal version of feminism where feminism somehow becomes against patriarchy, which never happened outside of the mid-20th century, because the first 100 years or so were clearly in line with patriarchy, that becomes a defining moment. So we have a very, very short historical memory of the world. We have an extremely short memory of the terms that we're speaking through. And then we impose that contemporary meaning on everything that we do. So racism doesn't become about power, rape, lynching, castration, etc. Racism becomes about civil rights. It becomes about equality, right? Black men don't become vulnerable because when you look at in terms of, you change everything to identity and then you use the markers of Title VII, oh, well, Black men are privileged. But the only way you got to the idea that Black men were privileged is you skipped over the mid 1940s, where white women were saying, we're going to base our oppression on Black men, right? White women were saying, to prove that women are a minority group, then we're going to start looking at Black people, specifically some of the experiences that Black men have under patriarchy. And we're going to use their oppression as a model to prove that white women are subject to patriarchy. So there's a whole history by which white feminists are utilizing the experiences of black men, especially in the South, to get the arguments and get a notion of the oppression that has now become synonymous with women's oppression under patriarchy. Now you fast forward 30, 40 years and black men somehow become culprits in a system of patriarchy that they were initially looked at as the model minority for, so to speak. So it's a kind of dishonesty
turn right there. That's a turn. That's an extreme turn.
It's an extreme turn, and people get upset. And this is why Black male studies is so illuminating, because it makes the counterintuitive the most obvious argument to explain what's going on now. Once we read, like, it makes complete sense that if you have a system that's patriarchal, that it would castrate and lynch and mutilate the body of the opposing racial male, because that's its fear. If you're in a society built on male power and you don't value, women as threats to that male power, then you're going to target other men, which is what we see in genocides as well as generally in conflicts all across the world.
And right? See, now that you brought that up, let's talk about that, like the treatment of black males and how it mirrors the treatment of other racialized groups, throughout history. Like, I think, what perturbed me is that some, I guess moderate white people or moderate liberals or whatnot, usually white, that are largely ignorant about a lot of different issues, as we all are, the ones we don't read about, right? Mm-hmm. But they'll typically say something like, well, you can't compare, the white nationalists or this uptick, or this really like a random resurgence of this. You can't compare it to the Nazis, or you can't compare it to the oppressors and, colonized areas throughout history. And I was like, actually, you can. They're all very, very relatable if you look at them and study it. But what would you say about that?
Well, actually, I mean, that's what my next book is on. It's comparing racially subjugated men. So I've come up with this argument of phallicism, which I call the racially subjugated male thesis, which says that in any patriarchal society that's subject to extreme racial repression, that you will find the construction of racialized men as both rapists or sexual threats, and as victims of rape or sexual fetishes. And you see the same thing in Nazi Germany with Jewish boys, right? Especially in internment camps. You see Nazis constructing Jewish men as threats to the reproduction of German women, and they called them filthy, and they called them animals, and they called them rapists. And simultaneously, within internment camps, labor camps, you found German SS raping Jewish boys, depriving them of food, starving them, and then having their way with them because they had little resistance. There are stories of Jewish men crying, thinking about the horrors that they suffered as young men by German SS because they were victims of rape. And that reality is something that we see a mirror reflection of when we talk about Jim Crow and slavery. You see black men in Jim Crow being victims of rape by white women and white men. During slavery, there are multiple accounts of black men being victims of rape. There are accounts of black men being married off to have children for white men. They're studs, so to speak. So they're being forced into relationships with women merely for the purpose of reproduction. And you see the same thing, the same stereotypes. Every racialized man that has come in contact with Europe has become a rapist. Every racialized man has simultaneously been less masculine than white men and subject to the homoeroticism and rape of colonizers. So to suggest that you can't, in fact, draw parallels between two or multiple identical racialized circumstances and the effects and specific violences that racialized men suffered under those regimes seems ridiculous. And especially when you look at something like Whitman's book on America's model, or Germany's American model, or Nazis' American model for the Holocaust. When you look at the kind of exchanges between, German soldiers and how they were studying the American Jim Crow system in the South, then you see that the evidence to draw parallels is actually quite accurate, one might think.
Let me shift gears here, and I hate to do that because this is something I wanted to get to before we run out of time. In the prologue of your book, you said something that was very, very distinct, and like it stuck with me that I remembered. I didn't have to write it down, but you said that a lot of times when you try to discuss these issues, and even in like a political sphere or a random sphere, like it seems like these issues have to be like put down so that you can elevate the voices of Black women. And I'm wondering why did you phrase it that way in the book? Because that's a powerful message. That's just a prologue.
Well, I think that because there is this zero-sum calculus between identity, that Black men are forced to start an academy from a position of apologetic. Like we have to apologize for wanting to speak about ourselves, and anything short of that apology becomes read as sexism or misogyny. So I can't tell you how many times just presenting papers about Black males, be it rape, be it domestic abuse, I mean, we've researched so many things about Black men, disability, any of those conversations automatically become sexist. And the argument is you hate women because you're talking about Black men. So that's why I started with that, is that Black men who want to speak about the vulnerabilities of Black men are denied a language, they're denied a platform, they're denied a space to do so. And anytime you defy that, the criticisms waged against you are all ad hominem. That for you to care, I mean, think about it, the argument. Funny segue, story. I did not know a year or two ago. I pretty much finished the book. I finished the book December of 2015, or maybe it was 2016. That was 2015 because it took a year to come out. I didn't know what men's rights were. I didn't know what the MRA was, right? Because they're not really present in any literature or any of the things that I read. And someone said, "You're a men's rights activist." And I was like, I don't exactly. So of course I go and look this stuff up. And I see all these disgruntled white men, right, talking about, against feminism, against civil rights, etc. So then I re-engaged the person. I was like, well, then what, there are no Black men that I know that endorse men's rights. So what is the argument that somehow makes my argument men's rights? And their argument was that, well, you say Black men are victims of domestic abuse. I was like, because they are. You say Black men are raped, because they are. It becomes an argument that if you say anything against the contemporary gender theories or the narrative that we hold, if you try to test it, if you try to contradict it, then it becomes you fall into this other camp. And of course, that's silly, right? Given that I didn't even know what that other camp was until after I wrote the book, but it's something that's working in kind of the ideological. It's part of the ideological baggage that we have of these paradigms. That any disagreement is not factual, it's moral. So anyone who disagrees with intersectionality or Black feminism, or even if I say, listen, I prefer genocide studies and social dominance theory to these theories, well, you become a morally condemnable person. And I think that's why in the epilogue I talk about this subject problem, is that the argument is not that Black men do not in fact suffer this kind of violence. It's not that the facts are wrong, that the proof we have is inadequate. Is that no one wants to talk about it because they say you should not talk about it. So you've already picked the subject that's going to represent racism and sexism and sexual vulnerability are Black women. So that means that Black men, be they straight, be they queer, be they raped, not raped, be they castrated or not castrated, lynched or not lynched, those violences are confined and made lesser than others. And I don't understand that dynamic, given that now that we know that Black men have been victims of rape, this fundamentally changes how we view the whole process beyond these notions of power or just femininity. Now that we know that Eldridge Cleaver had a sexual relationship with another man and referred to himself as a homosexual in prison, this fundamentally changes what we think in terms of revolutionary masculinity or revolutionary Black masculinity in the 1950s and 60s, right, after Jim Crow. Now that we know that Black men are victims of intimate partner violence, that fundamentally changes the idea that Black men are only perpetrators of violence, right? That we know that Black men suffer from depression and suicide. All this should change how we theorize Black maleness. But because people don't want to get outside the box that we've built so neatly around the idea of female vulnerability, I fear that this is going to be an ongoing battle, that they will continue to condemn, Black males for trying to expand the conversation when it's outside the purview of their theories. And there are very good theories. There are very empirically based theories like social dominance theory by Sedanius that really does just create this illuminating force to understand why you have these different disadvantages and stratifications of Black males and other racialized males the world over within these patriarchal capitalistic societies. But we don't teach people that. Like, you don't read Sedanius's work on social dominance in a gender class. You don't read Sedanius's work in a Black studies class or Africana studies class. In fact, I taught the first Black male studies course at my university. No surprise, but at Texas A&M, last semester, and the response was overwhelmingly positive. People enjoyed the course; they enjoy what they learned. So this is not a world where there is not other information and other resources to theorize Black males. This is a world where people have been denied that opportunity, have been deterred from talking about facts and reality in favor of ideology, and have been punished with character assassinations and threats when they chose to do so.
Let me ask you this: you separated sociology and some of the other, what I would still consider a liberal art, from liberal arts like English and literature. Can you expand on that? And then also, if you could, also expand on what you meant by identity, like
sure.
What you mean by identity politics.
So I separated it because at this point I'm tired of dealing with disciplines that don't deal with facts. So I think we talk about sociology, even though sometimes it's in the liberal arts and most people think of it as social science, that it has some really interesting findings. It's factual. It doesn't have to always be correct, but it's at least trying to deal with facts, right? Things like history, facts, things like psychology. And I'm a big skeptic of psychology, but nonetheless, more facts than not, or attentive facts at least. I'm interested in seeing real things. I don't have much patience anymore to argue about literature and made up stories like The Color Purple and pretending that in fact gives an accurate depiction of Black men. That's the world I came up through, that because of in literature, these were true stories, and it's funny to me because if you look at Alice Walker, it's an accurate picture of Black men, but you read something like Richard Wright and he's describing how these Black women were abusive and distant. Well, that's just misogyny and sexism. So I'm just not interested in having debates about the interpretive lens that we use, right? I think that we actually need to ground our theories of Black men and boys in our actual study of Black men and boys, that we need factual information from which we can theorize and conceptualize what their positionality in the world. And I think that relates to what I'm trying to get away from in terms of identity. The way that we think of identity has largely been a positive claim about who we are. So again, coming off of the back of the post-civil rights generation and the post-civil rights ideology, we're interested in, well, are we Black? Are we African-American? Are we gay? Are we queer? Are we, trans, etc.? And while there are certain issues around the bodies, right, certain material issues and vulnerabilities where trans people, gay peoples, Black heterosexual people, or heterosexual Blacks are going to be affected by different policies like incarceration versus HIV policy or prevention or access to healthcare or abortion, etc. Different bodies are affected by policy. That's not an identity argument. When you look at the neglect that Black people have to healthcare generally, if you don't have access to healthcare, you're not going to get treated or early identification for having HIV. That's going to affect a small group. If they're more proportional, that's going to affect a group that's more disproportionately exposed to the virus. If you don't have access to healthcare, you're going to also have bad prenatal care, which is going to lead to low birth weights and higher infant mortality, right? These are problems that stem from the same systemic structure, right? It's the same problem. Bodies just are affected differently by that problem. So what we've done is we've claimed all those disparities as identities. And I don't understand the point of that. If we're not having actual conversations about the vulnerability of Black bodies within actual structures, which is why I created the term of Black male vulnerability, how Black men are empirically, sociologically, politically, economically, etc., made vulnerable under systems of patriarchy, capitalism, and racism, then we're not actually doing real work. Because I find that despite what the millions of ways people articulate intersectionality, when it comes down to it, there are certain a priori or certain non-empirical starting points, like maleness is always privilege and patriarchy, that is untouchable with evidence. because that's already been disproven, right? But no matter what, that's just what we say. It's part of the theory. And I understand where Crenshaw gets it from. It's from her reading of Catherine McKinnon, but nonetheless, that's just wrong. So if you start off with a theory and say we're going to use this theory to interpret everyone, and you don't allow certain premises of that theory to be tested or are subject to evidence, then you're going to end up with exactly what we're talking about: the retreat into identity and the assertion that identity is the basis by which one should speak or can speak the truth, whereas everyone else who does not have that identity somehow should remain silent, or either don't possess the same kind of truth as the person who is Black and female, or Black and queer, or whatever, multiple lists of subjugations you want to talk about.
Yeah, and I definitely think that that's definitely wrong. And bringing that to politics, I've seen it where like, oh, if you're not Black, you don't know this or that. And it's like, well, that may be true, but you're coming to this person for a specific expertise that they may have in a specific area, and being Black or white, that doesn't necessarily negate what they have to say on an area in which they have expertise, right?
Yeah. I mean, especially when you talk about race, right? I mean, I'm very resistant to the idea that white people can tell Black people what to do politically, because Black people's lives are at stake in whatever we do. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I don't negate the fact there's some white people, like Joe Fagan, for instance, other historians like Roediger, et cetera, that have done tremendous amounts of work in kind of the facticity of what whiteness is, either historically or sociologically. And I think that makes, immense contributions to how we think about racism and white supremacy in this country. If I just say, well, they're white, so I don't listen to them, it kind of misses the point. Now, if white people start saying, well, Black people should do X, Y, and Z, and it's Black people whose lives are constantly being at risk, I have a problem with that part. That's not the same. That's a different argument than can you be factually correct about an instance or a circumstance, right? And I think the same thing happens with Black men, is that we say, because I've been in conversations where Black men are constantly trying to say, listen, here's my experience with domestic abuse. And then, it's this kind of shut down moment where people are saying, well, no, that didn't happen to you, or you're lying, or even if that did happen, that's not the majority of the cases. And then when I pull out the data sets, and I was like, well, actually, that is majority of the cases, right? There are over 5 million Black men who are going to be victims of intimate partner violence in their lifetime. In 12 months, that's 1.5 million. Right, in terms of 12-month prevalence. And the numbers again for Black women are very similar. Black women are around 6.6 million lifetime prevalence, and their 12-month prevalence is actually lower. It's like 1.3. So you see this kind of bidirectionality even in the numbers of lifetime and 12-month prevalence that's reported by the CDC. So the fact that liberal arts theorists and gender theorists or feminists are denying this thing that we call facts, or at least the best idea, the best graphs of the situation that we have at our disposal, I don't know what to do about that, because I've had conversations where people said, Black men really, you're not really seeing 5.1 million Black male victims. You're really seeing 5.1 million perpetrators. So their view is the only reason that Black men are victims of Black female violence is because Black men attacked them first. And we have no evidence of that whatsoever. Even when you're interviewing Black men or talking to Black men about their experience with domestic violence, they're not reporting that they hit first. They're not reporting that this is them. It's not self-defense. But nobody listens to men generally, and especially they don't listen to Black men because of the stereotypes that affect us. So it's very difficult to get conversations about Black men being victims of violence, Black men having experiences of violence on the table in the first place.
Well, Professor, we've actually run out of time, but I really appreciate you coming on and having this discussion.
Thank you.
And I think that we basically trailblazed a lot of good ground here, and I look forward to kind of reading through the next book, because, like I said before, I think the parallels are there, and I think there's definitely you're standing on definitely great ground historically to make those arguments. And I think that this is something people need to recognize, because for some reason I think being Black, like our trials and the things that we struggle through are constantly being compared to what happened to Jewish people under the Nazis. And I think it's like it's found wanting for some reason. I'm like, well, it's not to try to compare the magnitude of the magnitude of oppression, right? It's really more or less to say that there are a lot of similarities between the right nationalist movement now that mirrors that. And a lot of that same condemnation that you levy towards that ideology should also be levied towards the ideology here and their hatred of Black people, because it's very, very similar. And I think that for some reason they see them distinctively as like separate when they're really very, very, very similar, and they shouldn't do that.
Well, look, if I could just end really briefly with something that happened.
Go ahead.
You know, I recently, last year, I spent some time at the USC Shoah Foundation, which is a Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies.
Okay.
And I learned a tremendous amount from my conversations with people, with scholars there, because they showed me that I even in me studying Black men, I started with the wrong assumption. So when I went to the Shoah, I discovered that Jewish men were being raped by the German SS. Right? It was in their archives. They were unaware that they had this, you know, this great resource and these histories of experiences. And then when I presented on Jewish boys being raped, the response I got from the Jewish scholars and genocide scholars were so humbling to me, because they acknowledged the humanity of Jewish men, and they were regretful that they missed this aspect of the Holocaust. That shocked me, because when I do the same work on Black men, I met with this kind of resistance. So it showed me that I started off with the wrong assumption. I started off with the assumption that I had to prove Black men's humanity because it would always be questioned, instead of starting off with Black men's humanity should not be questioned. And that was a lesson that I learned there, because I just never, I had never been in a room before that presentation at the Shoah. I had never been in a room where people were almost in tears over the suffering and abuse of males. Because in every other context, when I wrote about Black or brown men, there was nothing but dismissal and criticism. So that showed me the work that Black male studies can do, that it's there to socialize people into the intuitive empathy that you have with Black men and Black boys, that you have with brown boys and brown men, that you even have for comparing Black men and Jewish men and Armenian men and Japanese men or various Asian men. This is a paradigm that shows that their suffering matters too. And that is something that has to be historically investigated, something that has to be done with a comparative lens and a kind of compassion that I don't think currently exists within gender theory.
So I have to agree with that story. It's actually a very powerful message and a powerful lesson to be learned, but we're out of time. I want to leave a quote for you guys, and then I want to tell the professor to basically keep doing what he's doing. But in a time of universal deceit, telling the truth becomes a revolutionary act. So keep telling the truth, Professor. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, sir.
Richard, can you close it out?